Okay, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about claim validation and consumer and clinical testing. So today I have Brian with me, who I'll introduce shortly. Just to clarify, this webinar is being recorded and I'll be sending out the recording afterwards. There is also going to be a question and answer section towards the end. So there's a little Q&A button towards the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to put questions in there as we go through or save them to the end and we can answer those. So just to give you a summary of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to look at a breakdown of how and why consumer and clinical research is used. We're going to look at all the marketing benefits and all the compliance benefits and how you can look at choosing the appropriate study design and methodology to validate your claims. I'm also going to touch on the challenges of COVID-19. As we know, there's a global pandemic and there are some challenges during testing at the moment. So we'll look at those and how you can sort of navigate your way around those challenges. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Carys Smith. I'm the Regulatory Director at Ayton Global Research. We are specialists in consumer research. So we're looking at things like consumer perception claims. I've been at the company for about 8 years now. So I've kind of done things like study management and training director, and really found that there was a kind of gap in the information we're providing our clientele based on regulations, as well as our staff knowledge and things like that. So it's really been my passion to look at things like advertising regulation, certainly cosmetic regulation, where we do a lot of our testing, and make sure that we can provide the best research and advice possible for our clients there. So Brian, it's great to have you here as well. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Carys. So my name's Brian Ecclefield, and I've been working in the claims industry for the last 11 years. I've spent most of that time developing custom tailored protocols for skincare validation, more on the instrumental and expert grading side, so clinical testing as opposed to the consumer perception. I've worked for a couple other major labs over the course of that time, and I fell in love with the industry as a whole. And while I was working for said labs, I saw some things where I most definitely found some room for improvement. And based on that, over the last couple of years, I put together a team and we founded Validated Claim Support as an alternative to the CRO status quo. So it's all focused on transparency and using technology to back the panelist-facing controls and confidentiality.
Amazing.
Carol. I just wanted to mention, so you mentioned you conduct some clinical research on the consumer side, and at Validated Claim Support, we touch on that as well, but we're a little bit more focused on the clinical studies side. So I guess the big difference here is just in the way that things are described and the way that market research is conducted.
Absolutely. So I think we've discussed this as we've kind of touched on before. It's all kind of consumer research, but yours much more on the clinical route of having things like instrumental studies and basically the scientific kind of objective evidence behind claims. Whereas for Ayton, we really specialize in consumer perception and self-assessed claims. So we'll generally do things like in-home user trials where people are sent products to test at home, and then they'll assess it themselves and answer an online questionnaire. Whereas obviously people will come into your sort of laboratory and kind of test things that way and get an instrumental study. So often we hear the terms objective claims and subjective claims. Objective claims is very much what Validated Claim Support do, kind of a measurement. You can't kind of have an opinion on it, whereas what we do is much more kind of opinion based. And I think what was really great about having you on today, and I'm really appreciative of you being here, is there's certainly a place for both, and it can be really confusing for brands to know, which is the best evidence to have behind your claim, and when's it's appropriate to use both. So it'd be great to hear more about the kind of legal landscape behind validating claims in the USA, because obviously you're USA based, we're more EU based, and I know a lot of the people that have joined today would love to hear a bit more about the USA side.
Sure, absolutely. So obviously everyone's heard of the big player on the claims regulatory side, which would be the FDA in the US. And everyone knows that the FDA covers drug products and OTC active ingredients. One of the little known pieces or lesser known pieces is that the F stands for food, but it also touches directly upon cosmetic claims. So based on that, the FDA actually has jurisdiction over clinical testing laboratories that are operating in both the OTC and the cosmetic realms. And all testing laboratories within that particular area are supposed to be registered with and inspected by the FDA. During our last inspection in August, our auditor noted that cosmetic testing labs do actually fall under the same jurisdiction, but it's often a branch from the food group as opposed to the drug group who will come and conduct that particular assessment. So the strange thing is it's almost a little bit of a gray area, because depending on what types of claims you're providing, you may or may not be FDA registered at this time. And I think that some of the newer regulations that were related to the OTCs and the sunscreens, which were discussed last year, we're all still kind of waiting on new publications. I think those were somewhat focused around doubling down on the claims laboratories being an extension of manufacturing based on CFR Title 21. So based on all of that, I mean, there is most definitely a bit of confusion as to what's required and what's not. The FDA registration process in itself is a voluntary procedure, which the laboratories are supposed to go through. The only other way you could end up registered by the FDA, I guess, against your will, is if you were found to be, doing something rather unethical and impractical. So based on that, there's a lot of things changing, and I think we'll see that the regulations for testing laboratories start to become a bit more controlled as the FDA does finalize these new OTC monograph publications. And the landscape should change overall for the betterment of the consumer, because the more qualifications that testing labs need and the safer the products inevitably end up becoming before they hit the market, the better off the global consumer is. So that's the FDA. That's actually not really the main jurisdictional governing branch of claims in the US as far as practice goes. So really, our regulatory environment is much more industry governed, and major retailers and distributors tend to have their own safety and efficacy rules in place. Companies like Sephora, HSN, QVC, and even more recently, Amazon started to post their own guidances on what types of claims are allowed and required. And you have to really deal with that, which is different for every set of distribution channels. The FDA will still get involved for any of those specific drug-oriented claims. And then on top of all of that, you fall under the scrutiny of the National Advertising Division and the Better Business Bureau. So if you're making false or misleading claims, they're most likely the enforcement group that you're going to end up dealing with. In the end of it all, it's very important not to overstate your claims and to make 100% sure that you're following all posted and recommended guidelines, and that you really do understand the rules in your distribution channel. I think that one of the most important things that you could do as a brand is just make sure that you have a completely third-party, non-biased claims expert who consults with your legal teams. That's not the same as consulting with someone like Carys or me. You need somebody on your side on the back end walking you through what's safe to say and what's not. It's more our job to present what the data represents, and it's the claims expert's job to tell you what is and isn't safe to say on the air.
Amazing. That's such a helpful summary, and it's something I always find really interesting in the States compared to other countries, because like I said, there's really unclear legislation when it comes to things like the FDA. There's recommendations, but you don't have to register. So I think it's really common, I know that I see it a lot, where people will put misleading claims out there in the USA and end up with this massive lawsuit behind them because they haven't had to go through any kind of pre-register. But that's something I didn't know, and that's quite interesting. I knew it for QVC, but I didn't know that for Amazon, they're starting to put in their own sort of law, recommendations, I guess, for kind of claim evidence. So I think that's really, really helpful information. But certainly, I know we've discussed this, but the EU and other countries, especially now China, with the new regulations for cosmetics, it actually is part of that cosmetic development. You need to have your claims in place, let alone all of the advertising law as well, as you mentioned, sort of Better Business Bureau and companies like that. So over here, I think there's some really, really clear laws about having your claims validated. And it's really good to hear that the USA is going in the same direction. And I think for anyone listening who's part of a USA brand, I've always said this forever, if you're a global brand, if you want to sell globally, you may find that the regulations in the USA are maybe not as clearly outlined, and you might have internal data kind of for your claims or anything like that. But certainly when you're looking at growing your brand and going into these other countries like the EU and indeed China, where they've now got much stricter regulations for claims testing, that data that you have won't be valid, or it won't be enough, or it won't be relevant. So it's really, really important to think about all the markets that you're looking to launch in, certainly, instead of just kind of the one market that you're based in necessarily. But yeah, certainly with retailers as well. I know that, again, we've discussed this separately, Brian, certainly with the QVC kind of opportunities, that they do need claim validation there. And things like photo testing and things like that as well, which I know that you're quite specialist in.
So I guess outside of some of the official posted regulatory guidelines, which it sounds like are genuinely much more developed overseas, are there any other specific sort of trends which you think that North American companies should be cognizant of?
I think that's it. I think for me, when I work with clients that are in the USA, not necessarily independent brands, but certainly big sort of conglomerates, you know, your Estee Lauder, your Avon, a lot of them use internal testing to get their claims validated. And I'm aware that that isn't allowed in these other countries. Like I said, certainly in the EU and in China, it has to be independent research. So a lot of people kind of sell in the USA, and as I said, might have a global basis and be selling their products online without kind of considering these regulations. But it is the regulations of the country that your product is being sold that you need to be aware of. And generally, if you've got independent data from a third-party testing house like, you know, us, you're going to be a lot safer. You're going to be much, much safer kind of selling that product in the countries that you need to. So that would be kind of my main recommendation, outside of kind of, you know, just having your claims validated, to make sure that you're going to be safe when you go outside. But I mean, putting the law aside, what would be, you know, your most important reasons why you think claims should be validated?
Well, the biggest one is consumer safety, and that goes a long way into, I guess, part of what you were just discussing as well. So internal claims, when you have a brand who's actually kind of running the show, there's always going to be the concern of a bias, because there is the desire to have a positive outcome on the research that you are conducting, which really goes against the scientific method in general. So conducting your claims at a regulated third-party provider that has no bias one way or another, like with you guys or with us. I mean, if we're receiving a product, a lot of times clients want to know if the product is not performing as expected, so that they could get back to the bench and make something a bit better. The consumers have this unbelievable, I guess, direct experience now where products can launch incredibly quickly, and you've got things that can start in a garage and ramp up with the help of one of the really technologically focused third-party manufacturers. So, I mean, things can hit direct sale in record time. And based on that, the level of exposure that these products have almost, you know, overnight is staggering. So it's incredibly important that safety is first and foremost outside of regulatory with regard to things hitting the market. Outside of that, like you mentioned, there's a lot of lawsuits over misleading claims. I think it's more important than ever, because consumers have so much technology and social media at their fingertips. If you're going to be making misleading claims, you're going to be caught, not necessarily by the FDA or one of those regulatory bodies, but most certainly by one of your competitors or a consumer who ends up having a bad experience with the product. So it's imperative that people tend to focus on supporting claims, making sure that they're not overstepping the bounds, and working with teams like yours and mine to develop something that's both conservative and helps to differentiate their products and their core competencies.
Absolutely, and I think that's another thing, exactly that. How do you stand out against the competition? And that's a huge reason to validate claims. It's something that we often talk about, particularly like I work a lot with companies now that are part of the CBD industry. And there was a point where CBD clients weren't making claims because you can't make CBD claims, and especially in the EU. But you're a cosmetic brand and you've not got any claims on your product about what your cosmetic can do. How are you going to stand out against your competition? You can't just start making those claims, but you can certainly start validating claims that are appropriate for the product category and start standing out. So I mean, that's really where consumer research comes in quite a lot. Not just about validating the claims for evidence, but this is where we get a lot of kind of people that want to make their product stand out. What can we say about it? That's not necessarily objective, as mentioned, it's more subjective. You see a lot of kind of percentage claims in advertising. So 90% of people agree that my skin felt soft, and like I would buy this product. I recommend this product. These are all the sorts of things that I think people really overlook when they're looking to save money on claims testing and sort of say they won't make any claims about their product. It's the people that really use those. And as I mentioned earlier, I think things, all those other marketing benefits you can get through research, things like testimonials, and certainly before and after photos, and I kind of touched on that briefly, is something we've discussed a lot because we can really elevate our clients' marketing with things like before and after photos that are acceptable for QVC with you guys. So people could do a consumer test with us and then absolutely use your lab to get those really perfect marketing before and after photos that can be used with QVC. So there's definitely some, really good marketing benefits there as well. But it'd be great to hear about I know you sort of said you've had quite a lot of challenges because of the global pandemic, and I think it would be really interesting to hear some more about all of that.
Sure. So where to begin? It's been a crazy year for everybody, I'm quite sure. I guess we really got hit with the full brunt of COVID-19 in force. So back in March, we actually had about 7 or 8 of our staff members who ended up sick. At least we got it out of the way early, but we all effectively started quarantining. We shut the lab down on March 16th, and we didn't open again until July. So we had 4 months with no operations. All of our staff was furloughed and on unemployment. The last thing that I ever thought that we would be doing within basically 2 years of starting our lab was firing everybody in the short term in the hopes that they're going to come back but without like an actual date attached to it. So once we decided that not only was it allowed to head back to work, but it was safe, and we started to get some more positive responses from our panel testing base, we started to look at how we could reopen the lab. We developed a bunch of new SOPs about panelist safety and process flows throughout the space. We effectively stopped large panel testing and long duration and durability testing. So at this point, we don't allow any panelists to be on site for longer than a 2-hour period. If we need them to be on site longer than that, we'll actually contract a space within our building that allows us to have more capacity than our testing rooms do. So I mean, that's a huge challenge in upon itself. We had to shut down our photobiology and SPF testing lab. We'll get back into it at some point, but just the amount of time that people were spending on site, we decided was too high of a risk, and it was too difficult to get people to agree to. We just weren't ready until we got to learn more about the disease. And we're really glad that we made those decisions because we were able to focus on some of this high-end before and after photography, like you mentioned, and some of the specialty consumer and the consumer and clinical level claims for skincare, for hair care, a lot of those instrumental assessments. So we kind of been able to refocus our lab space into one of the major areas that we had been operating in. Shutting down some of the other sectors gave us the ability to expand, to really fine tune what we do and design the space so that it's socially distant, it's safe, and that people feel comfortable. And we've had really good feedback so far. It's definitely not feeling normal yet, the way that we're going about everything, but hopefully things continue to pick up with regard to that. It's really been an absolutely bonkers year in that regard. So I'm sure you guys had your own share of trials and tribulations as well, and that responses from some of your consumer base were, a lot different than they would have been, but maybe you had a slightly different experience with how directly COVID impacted Ayton. Can you possibly let us know a bit about that?
Absolutely. So it's great to hear how you guys have adjusted for a start. I mean, like you said, you've been quite a fresh company. I think you've done amazingly that you were still able to conduct a lot of those studies that you need to, and you've adjusted there. But yes, certainly it was, we had a very different impact, as you say, because most of our studies, I mentioned earlier, are in-home user studies. So the actual being able to run a study has not changed. We're still sending products to people at home. And in fact, most people stayed at home and were forced to stay at home. So a lot of the panelists were really keen to test products. But it's certainly been different for us. We were already migrating into an online system, luckily, in terms of our documentation, because we all had to go home straight away. I was actually personally on holiday skiing the week that everything went into lockdown. So I came home to nothing. I had no office set up. I had no preparation. But no, it's worked out reasonably well. It was scary for a time there in terms of, are we still going to get studies in? So as I said, our services were still operating, but many of our clients, put a hold on lots of studies because they didn't know what was going to happen. A lot of our clients couldn't get the materials they needed. Their suppliers for their ingredients stopped, so they couldn't develop their products. But in fact, it's all kind of turned itself around, and we're now doing incredibly well. And we're very lucky in that basis, as mentioned. And it's mainly, unfortunately, from your guys' side, due to a lot of clinical testing houses kind of having to shut, people have really reevaluated the kind of, acceptability of consumer, in-home user trials. And it's something that I know that we touched again on is what I think is a really important way to look at this moving forward, is when you're developing a product and you have all these claims, is to say, what can I do through consumer research and what needs to be an instrumental study? Whereas instead of going, all of this needs to be instrumental, I want to say this, and that all has to be done through clinical, it's kind of an overwhelming thing to ask during these times. Whereas, if you've got a moisturizer and you've got all these different claims about it, the chances are many of them can be done through consumer research, and you could pick 2 or 3 claims, maybe something like 24-hour moisturization, or something to do with the more scientific evidence there, and just have those done through a clinical partner. And it's something that we, as we've said, we would happily review for people and say, this is your list of claims. I would recommend, you use validated claim support for the clinical testing, and we can do the consumer testing as well. Because as mentioned, it's not, when it comes to instrumental studies, obviously that's one single study as a group of panelists testing that kind of on that equipment. Whereas a consumer study, you can do all of them at once because someone's just assessing them. You may just find that you need that clinical evidence as well, particularly for some claims. So it's something that, we can absolutely always look at working on together. There's not going to be just this, it needs to be clinical or it needs to be consumer. We can really look at things and kind of go that way as well. So I think that was kind of my sort of way there, is to say, is there a way that we can combine clinical research and consumer research? I know I've touched on it. Is there anything you kind of want to add to that, Brian?
Yeah, I think you did a really good job of kind of bringing everything together. The big thing that we tend to see is that we get a lot of products in this day and age that are coming in with, let's say, like a general anti-aging style feel. But our sponsors will ask us to do things like evaluate fine lines and wrinkles instrumentally, look at skin toning, check out potentially age spots via chromometer, maybe get in there and look at pore size, blemishes are going to be reduced. And we're sitting there and we're kind of wondering what the new magic actives in these products are. Like, how are you expecting to tackle that many claims in this preliminary study? So by breaking things down into both sort of consumer research and then the clinical side, I think it's really helpful for brands to focus on, there's 1 or 2 sort of core claims at the clinical level, and maybe do some of that consumer element piece to pull and tie everything together, because the look and the feel of the product and the appearance of change are things that you can most definitely pull from those sensory panels. And in kind of the conjunction of working together, we could always most definitely operate a subset of a larger consumer panel that you guys are running. We could put together a small panel of individuals for that high-end before and after clinical photography. And if there are some really compelling visual changes, we could most certainly find and document the delta or the change from one time point to the next. So I think working together to continue the education process on how claims work, and then really striving to help people focus on the core claims, maybe not shooting for the moon with every individual new reformulation that they come up with. But I mean, all these things are really going to go hand in hand to making sure that products are tested safely, making sure that we're getting the most out of the research that we conduct, and providing a real value, because there's something to be said for, again, not charging somebody, exorbitant prices for a little test just because, they had high hopes and dreams. So together we can work to pilot some of these studies, get some initial feedback, and find out what really works.
Definitely. That's a huge thing as well. It's not just about, what can actually be done with the kind of complexities of the world right now, but yeah, price is such a huge thing. If you're kind of looking at, like you said, shooting for the moon, getting all these like loads and loads of claims all done in a laboratory, it will cost a fortune. Whereas you can very much do these, preliminary like consumer study, say this is what we're seeing from the self-assessed claims. Now we can invest that money because we're quite confident in the product. So yeah, definitely. But yeah, I would love to open up to a Q&A now. I hope people have got some questions and answers. Please challenge us. We'll be very happy to kind of help where we can. So I'll leave that open for a minute. I'll leave that open for a minute and see what comes in. But if not, I will be sending out our contact information at the end of this when I send out the recording. So if there's nothing you've got to ask desperately now, don't worry, you can ask it at a later point. Okay, great, we've got a question in. And this is for Brian. So can you please share your details in the US and what kind of testing facilities you have, specifically looking at hair care?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. So validated claim support is roughly 10,000 square feet of clinical space that's oriented around primarily skincare, cosmetics, and hair care. We do have a full hair salon on site. And for hair studies, we'll generally bring in a cosmetologist for professional level products or things that require a second person for assistance. If there's any kind of hair volumizing or, let's say, durability for hair dye, duration for any kind of like frizz control or flyaway products. We'll also look at the styling or volume density, I guess the appearance of that sort of, what I like to say, growth without the growth, if you're not talking about OTC active ingredients and competitors to minoxidil. So release and recovery, density and volume being key. And a lot of what we'll look at is either microscopic evaluations of individual hairs, or we'll do our validated clinical photography to control the before image, make sure that panelists are in exactly the same position. We'll have a cosmetologist style the hair after just a placebo wash in water or with a vehicular shampoo and conditioner. And then we'll do a treatment wash under exactly the same conditions, get people into the studio, and then take a photograph and see what's changing over time. But that works with controlled washes, multiple application scenarios, and really any kind of temporary styling type product as well. So quite a lot of comparative claims. Duration, durability for washes could be 8 washes or like 28 days worth of use. And then a lot of those release and recovery hair regrowth products tend to take anywhere from 3 to 6 months on the minimum. Pretty much full spectrum for hair care products.
Amazing, thanks, Brian. Certainly for kind of our side with hair care, what we would usually do is if you did a clinical study like that, we really come in with those more marketing claims, as I say, with kind of things like suitable for hair types. So when you've got that smaller kind of panel, you might want to test on lots of different hair ethnicity. That's quite common at the moment, where people want to say they're kind of, acceptable for all kinds of hair type. And that's really where we would come in to really substantiate those claims on those much larger panels that go outside of what kind of is tested in the lab there. So yeah, a lot of what we do is kind of further backing up the clinical hair care. I've got another question in here, which says, what should come first, clinical or consumer testing? So from my side, kind of answering that one, there isn't necessarily a right way to do it or a wrong way to do it. Unless it's to do with the safety, as Brian said earlier, obviously if it's any kind of safety testing, that always has to come first. It has to be safe to use. But otherwise, we actually work with clients that do it either way. Sometimes, as I kind of mentioned earlier, you may find that you do a consumer test first, kind of decide whether if those self-assessed claims are backed up, and then people, can invest that further money on those claims if you've already had the consumer so they can perceive it. And we also work the other way around, where some people will get clinical testing done first, make sure they've got that data to say, yep, it's scientifically proven it will have this effect. Now I want to work on a larger panel and do it that way. So certainly from my side, it can be either. There's no right or wrong. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Brian.
I think you pretty much hit it on the head. It can be done both ways. And realistically, the most important thing here to take away is if you are breaking it out and doing like one and then the other, whether it's consumer and then clinical or vice versa, make sure you got some of the safety data available before we start looking at the stuff. Because if you find out later that you're having some kind of primary irritation or sensitization, all your other work is going to end up being for naught. And try and space them out, because you might find that your consumer study doesn't necessarily provide you with the data that you were hoping for. But at the instrumental level, maybe you are seeing some really high level results. Quite the opposite can happen as well. So sometimes instrumentally we won't see anything, but consumers love the product because they love the way it feels. So all these things kind of play hand in hand. But most importantly, if you are talking about spacing them out, that is the big takeaway. So try not to cram it all in at the last possible minute. I know like timelines and deadlines are incredible and they're always impending, like death and taxes at this point. But when you come to us 2 months before you launch a product and you tell us that the pack has already been printed and it says that this product's going to be moisturizing up to 25%, that doesn't really leave us a lot of leeway. And I mean, we're gonna play it how it is, and we're gonna tell you what data we receive. So definitely try and wait to see where your claims development takes you before you go finalize and pack and market it.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. And even on that, if you're going to go with the route of either clinical or both clinical and consumer testing, you may find, as Brian said, I mean, we get it a lot, if a clinical test isn't used or it doesn't go the way as planned, we can change the claim wording to be accepted with consumer testing, but you can't use that same kind of like objective wording in your claims from a clinical test if you have consumer results. There's a different kind of way to word claims. So don't print out your results until you know what your evidence is, where you have clinical or consumer, because yeah, it's going to be worded slightly differently. Another question on this from the same person, who dictates or advises what tests need to be done, the client or the testing agency? Again, everyone works slightly differently. So we work with some clients who have never done a consumer test before. They've never done, any kind of testing, and they're quite new to the game. In that case, we really advise the tests. So I would look at a client's product, how they're going to present their claims, what claims they want to make. And as I said earlier, usually I'll try and substantiate what I can through consumer research, and maybe pick those claims out that need instrumental studies to help with it. There's other cases where there's some clients I work with who know exactly what testing they need. Certainly those larger companies have an entire team that will be, regulatory team. They'll know what evidence is needed behind those claims. So you've got to be versatile, and we kind of work however is needed for our clients. Again, Brian, if you've got anything to add.
Sure. So the I mean, really, like you said, it's a very hand-in-hand bespoke process. Every company has a different way about going through their claims validation. And depending on the size of the company, depending on the experience of the individuals on the sponsor side, it may end up being that the claims house or the testing group that you go with kind of guides you through best industry practices, what their experience is. Or, I mean, we could end up just flat out receiving a massive questionnaire and have something that's really pre-written. So we're just kind of going through the steps and following a tried and true protocol and test methodology that a company has been doing for years. That all aside, there are completely third-party specialists out there. And we work with two on the consulting level. I'd be happy to pass on information about. So one of them is a prominent statistician who can help you really get the most out of your clinical data. And the other is more of like a general claims expert who can help you walk that fine line in between the, in the gray area between what's saying too much and what could put you at risk, and then what's just not necessarily saying enough. So working with somebody like that who doesn't have a compelling, let's say any skin in the game one way or another is key. Because as a testing group, obviously, Carys and I have our own experience, and we also have methods that, may be preferable on our side. So, working with somebody completely out of the spectrum whose focus is specifically on claims is key, even if it's just at the consulting level.
Absolutely. I think it never hurts to ask for advice if you're not sure. Certainly.
Definitely.
And then just another question as well for you again, Brian, just following on from the hair care studies. Is your salon operating at the moment, and what kind of hair types do you have access to?
So salon it's not really full-time operating. I wouldn't say that. It's kind of on call. So we don't have a current hair study running this month. We've got 3 in the running. And I guess in our location, which is in Teaneck, New Jersey, we're about 2 miles from New York City, right across the George Washington Bridge. We've got an incredibly diverse panel group around the area. There's a massive Japanese and Korean contingent in the Fort Lee area. There's a massive African-American contingent around the area. Pagoda in New Jersey has a very big Hispanic population. So we've got a huge demographic. The nice thing about validated claim support is not only do we work with our internal pool, but we also have 3 different levels of outside recruitment, which we'll seek. So if you were looking at something very, very specific with regard to ethnicity and demographics, we would contract out the work to one of our third-party recruitment groups, and we could most certainly isolate specific ethnic hair types and just individual conditions. So some of these hair studies we're doing are quite specific. So you're talking about finding women who are aged between 25 and 35 who are experiencing early onset hair thinning and hair loss. I mean, that's quite difficult. There's really not a lot of people who fit into that. When you start throwing around different hair types and demographics, that becomes a particularly difficult recruit. And to be honest, those are some of our favorite projects to take on because the difficulties end up making them completely unique.
Great, thank you. And another question for you again, Brian. How many subjects do you suggest to integrate in an anti-aging clinical evaluation?
Great question. So generally speaking, the industry standard tends to hover around 30 as a minimum, and that's for both statistical reasons and I guess what I would call best industry practice. It's kind of a strange realm, again, in the US because a lot of these cosmetic and skincare claims are based off of the pharmaceutical monograph level publications. And if you go back and you look at FDA for sunscreen or antiperspirant, you've always talked about 10 and 20 subjects for these final label claims, which just seem like such random numbers. You will find some groups out there that look at 20 as the bare minimum. For years, the Skin Cancer Foundation looked at phototox and photoallergy potential and patch testing on a minimum of 20 subjects. But I think really 30 tends to be the standard. And 30 is a good starting place. You're always going to have some dropout from a study. So a couple people aren't going to end up completing for one reason or another. A lot of times we'll try and start right now between 30, 35, depending on the study, we might go out to 37 or 40 if it's not super specific, but the goal is to get down to completing with 30. I think that's sort of the magic number. What do you think about that, Carys?
Great. Yeah, no, with consumer testing, it's usually a lot larger, but that's simply because, as I mentioned earlier, it's subjective. So, when you're looking at any kind of research ever, as you know, you've got your controllables and everything like that. And when it's a self-assessment, there's a lot less that you control. It's opinion-based. So the larger the panel base, the better. We'd usually say about 100 responses for most studies. But it really depends on what the panel requirements are, because a lot of the time we're segmenting data based on your market, things you're looking at, your panel requirements. So as Brian said, about 30, that's like the minimum that we would want to have on a subgroup. So that's quite common, as I said, when you're looking at consumer research data, it's a really good chance to start looking at all those different subgroups, have people from different ethnicities that have different skin types, but you still want to have a significant amount of people in each group. So really, yeah, 30 is quite a good minimum, as you said, for statistical reasons. That's usually why that's in place. But yes, certainly when it comes to consumer research, take it as an opportunity to get more data. And again, as I was saying earlier, it can often be used to further kind of substantiate things that have been validated through clinical testing. And it might be that you have 30-person clinical test and you say, now I want to have 100 people to self-assess it and further substantiate it and get those marketing claims. And certainly, as I was mentioning earlier as well about percentage claims, you have to quote how many people you've tested on in your advertising. So again, the bigger the pool of volunteers, the better it looks in your marketing material. So it's very different to clinical testing. You're sending products out, so you've got a lot more opportunity to get kind of much bigger panel sizes. And certainly if you were just using consumer research data on its own, because it's got such a margin of kind of difference there, because it's all about opinion, 30 people on its own probably wouldn't be accepted by most advertising standards or retail platforms, whereas 100 responses would be, which is very different to clinical, because clinical evaluation can often be accepted there. The other thing I just wanted to say with that one about anti-aging kind of evaluation as well, that's a really good example of where you might want to use both clinical and consumer research, because anti-aging can cover so many things. When you're looking at skin, there's so many things you might want to measure there. And certainly, I think there's a lot that you could do through consumer research and then really pinpoint things like age spots and wrinkles, and that can all be kind of your clinical evaluation. And then those consumer evaluations can just be the overall, I feel like I look younger, things like that. So I think that's a really good example of something that you would kind of use both kinds of testing on. So another question in. So how long does it, well, there's quite a good open-ended or ended question, really. How long does clinical testing take? And do you have at all any encompassing cost kind of brackets that you can share?
So I guess you're looking at me here, Carys, to start on this one.
Clinical testing to start off. So yeah, like I said, it might be a bit of the how long is a piece of string with the how long does it take?
Well, that's all right. I mean, there's generally at least a pretty good sort of construction element timeline that we could describe. So on the upfront side, prior to COVID-19, we would always say it would be roughly 2 weeks for us to sort of write up a protocol, come to an agreement with the sponsor, and then 2 weeks from there to get into recruiting, so that we've got enough time to make sure that we could fill the demographic profile once the protocol is finally approved. So that's about 1 month prior to a test starting. Now with COVID, we are definitely seeing we're just building in a slightly longer recruiting timepiece, because we're only getting about 70 or 75% of our prior respondents who are like 100% comfortable coming back. So based on that, we're saying really 3 weeks, 4 weeks on the recruiting side is ideal. So call it 5 or 6 weeks on the front end before we start any evaluations. The next step would be the active phase of testing, which depending on what you're doing could be as short as 1 day if we're looking at like an immediate moisturization claim, or like long wear durability if we're doing some kind of controlled wash on site for a hair care product. So we could have one active day, or if it's a long-term product like anti-aging, we could end up going out to 8 weeks or 12 weeks, depending on the nature of, what your claim timeline is. So 6 weeks up front, give or take, whatever that active phase is next. And then following that, 3 weeks or so, 3 to 4 weeks to compile all of the data, get the statistical analysis done, and send out a final report. So all of that is variable just based on the difficulty of the recruiting element, how specific the test is, how many evaluations there are. Prime example would be if you're looking at a condition that is either cyclical or not always apparent, such as active acne lesions or something like cold sores. So something where we need to actually go and find active lesions, not just people who have these symptoms from time to time. That will most certainly impact the timeline. But I think it's a very fair starting point to say 4 to 6 weeks up front to build the study out and work with recruiting, active phase of testing based on your specific claims, and then another 3 to 4 weeks to compile everything. And then from a cost perspective, most of the stuff we do, there's basic safety testing work, such as human repeat insult patch test or patch testing. That stuff runs at about $1,200 per, not about that. We can run those at about $1,200 per sample. That's one of the most basic individual tests that customers will come to us looking for. It's very well known in the industry. It gives you the immediate primary irritation as well as the long-term sensitization elements. And you can also have it administered by dermatologists to support some secondary claims. So starting point, figure 1,200 range. The rest really is just up to how many claims you're looking to make. So we might start at a couple $100 per subject for something rather basic and then work our way up from there. Happy to chat offline about anything specific on the pricing side that you might be interested in.
Amazing. And yeah, I think certainly from a consumer point of view, from consumer testing point of view, things are much quicker, which is obviously why people want to do it. We don't have to recruit people to come into a lab. They can just be sent products at home. And our pricing structure obviously works out a bit different as well, because we don't have an instrumental study per claim. It's just how many people do you want to test on and how long for. But I think a good question kind of brought up there with how long does it take. I often get asked this, and this is just kind of a advice, I guess, for anyone out there. Always think about how you're developing your product and the claims you want to make. So I get people come to me and ask, how long should I test this product for? But it really depends on when you're expecting the participants to see the benefits and how you develop that product. I'd hate to give advice there and not give you the correct duration, because we can have an eye cream that maybe some people have developed an eye cream that will have an effect in a day and they can do that evaluation, and others might have an eye cream they want to test over 3 months because they know there's a benefit that will continue to add. So there's no kind of definite guideline when it comes to testing durations. It really depends on how you formulated the product and how you want to market it as well. We've worked with people that want to have a 3-month study because they want people to use it for 3 months and continue to have that effect, and other people that want to have those instant effects as well. So always really consider how you're, consider it while you're developing the product. Think about those claims as you're putting those ingredients together. So another question. So can you do clinical and consumer testing at the same time and with the same test subjects? It's an interesting question. It would again depend on the test and everything like that. You technically can. You might not always want to or need to in terms of convenience. As mentioned, consumer testing can be much quicker and clinical testing can take a bit longer. And if you wanted to get those results at the same time, you could run them, side by side and get the results at different times. And with the same test subjects, again, you could, but you might not necessarily need to. I know that when me and Brian have talked about photo studies, we would have the same test subjects. So they do a consumer study and then they'd go in for their photos as well. So they would certainly be on the same test. But I don't know, what do you think about that, Brian?
It's another one of those questions where I think it's completely sponsor dependent. Another way you could go about it is again, we don't really have a perfect answer for whether you should be doing the consumer or the clinical first. Now, talking about doing them at the same time, you can always collect a little bit of consumer data during your clinical test. So perfect thing to do might be to run like a 5 or 10 subject pilot test before you get into your hard claims. Let somebody like us handle the instrumental evaluations. I mean, we're always happy to throw in a couple of questionnaire sensory feedback questions. We don't have the same capabilities that Ayton Global and Carys have, but we can still get some general feedback there. Then we'll hone in on what your instrumental best fit claims are. So you can run the clinical piece, and you could reach out to Carys and figure out exactly which particular qualitative questionnaires, in fact, you do have the best fit on. So you might, in that way, be able to kind of get the best bang for your buck by almost getting some preliminary information about which questions aren't working, maybe going back and looking to see if you can rephrase them slightly to perhaps, coax a slightly better positive result out of the respondents. So, I mean, really, the issue that doing them at the same time puts you in is, all your eggs are in that one basket. So you don't have the ability to pivot if things don't go your way. So I think trying to stagger it is always going to be the best option if you can. And it won't always work out that way. We all know how those timelines can work and how things can end up crunching down in a hurry. So when you're unsure, reach out to Carys, reach out to myself at the same time when you're building out this claims package, and kind of let us walk you through what the benefits would be of doing it. Clinical first, the consumer side first, or side by side, and we'll see if we can't come together with like a best fit option.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and that's a good way to think of it. Don't feel like you can't ask consumer claims or perception claims as such during a clinical study. And as I said, then the consumer testing itself, this is why by saying, the same test subjects and everything like that, the consumer test should be beyond the clinical test. It should be larger. You kind of have bigger sites, whereas the clinical test should be something really focused and really specific. I think that's the best way to kind of overall think of it. Right, I think that's all about
absolutely.
Perfect. I think that's all about questions in. So thank you so much. They were really some really good questions, and have definitely got our cogs working in our brains to give you some good answers. But anyway, Brian, I would love to know if you've got anything you'd like to add before we close off today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. So I think this has been a great experience so far. Thanks so much for the invitation to chat with you on the webinar here. And I guess overall, we touched on a lot of different things between regulatory timelines, what the best fit is, what a lot of these difficulties this year have been. And I think as a lot of the brands and manufacturers start to delve back into focusing on their personal care products, the demand for more claims on the consumer side and the clinical side is going to continue to increase. So just keep in mind that we're here and we're not just a group that prints out data at the end of a particular study. So feel free to bounce ideas off us during the formulated processes. Wherever possible, get us involved with your marketing teams directly, because the real science behind these products should be driven by their efficacy, not just based on what your final end goals, hopes, and dreams are. And there will be a happy medium somewhere in between what marketing wants to say and how well your product works. So hopefully we can help get you there.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge message to drive for anyone, is that always think of claims as something that's integrated in your product development. Don't look at the claims and try and get the evidence. It should all work together. So always think about the claims really in the early on stages, and not just as something that you need to get validated right at the end. And yeah, we'll certainly be able to help. Thank you so much, Brian. I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. And thank you to all the listeners as well.
Thanks a lot, Carys. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.